with not only Sharik and the Center for American Muslim Philanthropy, but also the Lake Institute for Faith and Giving here at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And I'm going to turn it over briefly to David to say a word or two if he'd like, and then back to Sharik and our panelists. David.
Well, I've already taken notes of this was worth the price of admission. I know that it didn't cost you much, but the fact we had an overview of sort of the lineage and history of Muslim philanthropy and these interconnections was already something that I think sets a wonderful story for us as we think about hearing from interactions from those of you who are thinking about this work from within these kind of conversations. So Lake Institute is privileged to be a part of the School of Philanthropy and to really help foster understandings of the way that faith informs and inspires giving broadly across religious traditions and across a number of sectors within our nonprofit and philanthropic space. So we're delighted to listen in and be a part of this conversation and know that as we help to build a field of religion and philanthropy, this is an essential part that we hope to foster to continue to grow. So thank you all.
So with that, and we'll have each of our panelists introduce themselves and then make their remarks. And what I'll do is I'll ask Sunita, Iqbal, introduce yourself and lead off.
Okay. I'm Sunita Iqbal. I'm from the Nathan Cummings Foundation. I started in philanthropy about 4.5 years ago at the Mellon Foundation, specifically working in their performing arts portfolio. The Cummings Foundation is based in the Jewish tradition of giving, and they've always had a social justice lens. It's a family foundation. They are in their 4th generation of family board members at this point. So last year they decided to reframe their grant making. So they did a strategic planning process, and part of that was focusing in on climate change and inequality as the 2 issues that they would like to address with different frameworks. So one of them is racial economic justice, inclusive clean economies, and I'm on the voice, creativity, and culture team. So I'm more of an arts and culture background, but part of that framework, there are 2 sides to it. One is the arts and culture side, and then the other is religious traditions and contemplative practice. So I've been there for a very little time, since January 19th. So I'm still learning a bit about the history, but we're also forming our strategies as we go along. And part of what I would like to do, not only talking about how arts and culture can change narratives about Islamophobia and about Muslims more generally, but also I'm trying to get a MASA portfolio, Muslim Arab South Asian portfolio for Cummings Together. That's I feel like that's my role, going to be my role in this space. And I didn't think about it before I started working there, but it has evolved into this place where I was able to bring Hiller's Fund, who you'll hear from their ED soon, into the fold, and hopefully, knock on wood, they'll get approved by the board on Monday.
Fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Naran Khan, and I'm a program officer at the Ford Foundation in New York City. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm especially excited once we get through all of us to really talk to you and answer some questions. I think I have a kind of a funny position here in the sense that I feel, I'm a Muslim American for whom my faith is so important. It always has been to my personal and all other aspects of my life, quite frankly, grown up to now. And I now also have a career in philanthropy. And in one sense, the topic of this conversation totally makes sense for me. And in another, it doesn't so much, in the sense that my own grant-making focus is actually quite general. I work in the Office of the President at the Ford Foundation, and so my grant-making is from our kind of flexible, from our Flex Fund, which can span the gamut of not just thematic topics, but also geographies. And so while I do have some really valued and wonderful grantee partners, some of whom are here today, who do this work, that's not the focus of what I do. And so I feel deeply connected to this, but it's pretty disparate. One thing I do think it's important to point out is that my own personal civic activism and really the kind of roots of my own interest in social justice were with organizing within my own mosque community growing up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And in fact, my first encounter with philanthropy was applying for grant funding, for some of our activities once we had, folks from Bosnia and Kosovo, coming into the community developing programs. So this is, this is, not directly related, but somewhat related. A couple of things I did want to speak to, though, are just, in not just in this moment, but certainly in this moment, we as an institution focused on fighting inequality are absolutely thinking about American Muslims as a community. And it's actually, we work in, 7 pretty specifically defined thematic areas. It's not just in one area. Your intuitions might tell you that our intersectional, gender, racial, and ethnic justice portfolio might be thinking about this work, and in fact, that is true. But many of our other portfolios are thinking about American Muslims as a community and thinking about community philanthropy as well. And we have a philanthropy portfolio. We think about, we have a team called Youth Opportunity and Learning, and thinking about next generation leadership that very much touches upon the topic of today. We have an arts and culture portfolio called Creativity and Free Expression. All of these folks are intentionally thinking about American Muslims, and they are thinking about if we, as a large philanthropic institution, don't have the relationships or even the structures to make small grants, what does it look like to collaborate with folks who are embedded in the community, who can help make informed choices about where and how funds flow. So I'll say that on one end, and the other thing I'll say is just broadly speaking, I'm really excited by the development of institutions focused on American Muslim philanthropy. It's a long time coming, but it's really exciting that that these institutions are being set up and they're being professionalized and run in ways that are the best possible and most effective ways to engage in this timely topic. And so having grantee partners in this space, I'm thinking about the infrastructure of the institutions. How can we invest in the leadership of folks who are leading these organizations? How to think about the tremendous demands that are placed on them as leaders. And I say that because, and we have some of these leaders here so they can speak to this, but there's a lot of, I'm sure they have many requests for demands on their time and to be a representational voice, because other than government, philanthropy is really the space where you have an opportunity to have a landscape view of a situation. And so, you want to do the grant making, you want to have your relationships with grantee partners, you want to develop deep relationships, but I'm sure they're running around being on panels like this. So what does it take to help invest in their leadership and their capacity? And so I think there's just a lot of institutional infrastructure building questions about these organizations. But it's kind of a problem of abundance. It's an exciting moment, and it's one. I guess the other side of that coin would just be depressing. So this is great. People want to have these conversations. It's a good thing, and a lot of them are leanly staffed. So again, that contributes to those those concerns. And they're thinking about grants, grant making in the community sense, not through a national security lens. And it's a relief to be thinking that way now, I think. And I think they're balancing the short and long-term issues. There's a high need for rapid response for vulnerable communities, but life is a long game, and so we want everyone to be thinking about the long term too. And then the last thing I'll say is just there's such high scrutiny on American Muslims as a community. There's high scrutiny on our philanthropy and how we engage, and so just the level of excellence that we see in our partners is amazing, and we want that to continue, and we want more organizations, more diverse thinking, I have so much more to say. I'm especially excited to listen to your questions and to hear what our colleagues also have to say. But I think we're at the beginning of something really special, and the intentionality that Sharaki brought to this conversation is so important. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Sharit, for having us here. As Noreen just said, it's a really important beginning point for an incredibly important conversation, and there's great opportunity for us to evolve. My name is Zeba Rahman. I'm the Senior Program Officer for the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Arts Building Bridges program. And the foundation is housed under the mothership, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. We go by Doris's will, and one of her primary concerns was the well-being of Americans and American society. She left in her will the directive that the preservation and promotion of Islamic art should continue after her death. And the reason for that is that she was a lifelong Islamic art collector. She collected for more than 60 years, very seriously, and has a sizable collection that is in various museums around the US, but also in a house museum, her former home in Honolulu, in Hawaii, called Shangri-La. So it's a house museum, and it's in partnership with the Honolulu Museum of Art, and so there are regular docent tours there. It's also a study center where we have a scholars in residence program, an artist in residence program, and a curatorial studies, object preservation program in partnership with the museum. The other dimension of the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art is the grant-making program, which is housed in New York, and there's a program called the Building Bridges program, which I take care of. And our focus is, again, the well-being of our communities, and the way in which we interpret that is to work along the intersections of civic issues, the central civic issues of our era, and how arts and culture can support and advance relationships, connections, and understanding between American Muslims and the broader non-Muslim community. So that's what we pivot on. And so we find ourselves in the crosshairs of a very important issue, a central issue in the US and around the world, which is Islamophobia. So we also find that we're the sole ongoing program of its kind in the US. We're the youngest within our foundation. We were started in 2007 when the Board of Trustees really felt that it was important to activate a grant-making program. So we're about 10 years old. We're also the smallest in the foundation. We have 4 other programs. One of them is the medical research program with no animal testing, because Doris loved animals, and she had 2 pet camels who recently passed away, in fact. Yes. And also the environment. She cared deeply and about that, and child well-being, and the prevention of child abuse, very central issue to her, and then the broader arts program, which includes contemporary dance, theater, and jazz, all 3 disciplines that she studied and really cared deeply about. So, so those are our colleague programs, and as I said, we're the youngest and smallest of all the programs, the grant-making programs in the foundation. And we have found that through partnerships, both internal and external, many of our colleagues are here. We've partnered together on initiatives to really advance this work. Has been really beneficial, not just for the expanded financial capacity that it brings with it, but the ideas and perspectives, which is really important because it really drives our critical thinking as we think about programmatic strategies to really be supporting effective work in this space. So it is, as Noreen said, a very exciting moment, and as Sunita said, you know, we're from the art space. She is, I am. I spent more than 2 decades in the field as an artistic director and a curator of performing arts and film. And now I'm using that knowledge and that experience to really think through how the Building Bridges program can be its most effective, given the situation we're in. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Kashif Sheikh. I wanted to thank everyone for being here. I had the great privilege of being here last year. So thank you, Sharik and the team, for asking me to come back this year. I'm very excited. My name is Kashif Sheikh. I'm the executive director and co-founder of the Pillars Fund, which is based in Chicago, Illinois. Before I go into a little bit about sort of what we do and sort of how we think about sort of community philanthropy, I'll give you a little bit of context on myself. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and sort of activism and sort of social justice has always been a big part of my life. Particularly, and I think for me, there was a big turning point in my life in 2001 in Cincinnati. Timothy Thomas, who was an unarmed African American man, was killed, and it sparked a lot of riots in Cincinnati in neighborhoods that I used to sort of spend a lot of time in, and it had a profound impact on me. And the sad thing is, this was 2001, and these stories are all too common. They've been all too common for so long. But I think about that moment quite often, especially sort of given the work that I've been doing in philanthropy over the last 10, 11 years. So previous to sort of founding the Pillars Fund, I, much like Nuran, much like Zeba and Sunita, I worked at the McCormick Foundation, which is out in Chicago, where they focused on a number of different areas, but my portfolio was really specifically on economic development in low-income communities. So I did a lot of funding in Chicago, in the south and west sides of Chicago, in areas of education, particularly post-secondary education. And so I've been in the field for a little bit and have really come to understand and appreciate the power of philanthropy. And so with that, about 5 years ago, we had this opportunity to sort of, it was all kind of by happenstance. I happened to meet someone who some of you might know, Rami Nashashibi, who's the founder and executive director of an organization in Chicago called Iman. And he kind of brought me and a handful of philanthropists, young community philanthropists who had sort of the good fortune of making some money in their careers and were really looking for ways to give back. And many of them were kind of giving, all of them were giving sort of significant amounts of their personal wealth away on a sort of one-on-one way, where many of them were sort of just meeting with organizations and sort of seeding them themselves to the tune of $10, $15, $20, $50,000 in their own wealth. And what happened was that, in 2011, we kind of all came together with this idea we kind of came together because there's this idea that we started sort of recognizing that there was a lot of these community organizations, and then there was a lot of these sort of high net worth donors who wanted to sort of think about contributing, but there was no sort of pathway to sort of connect the two, because for too long there was such a big disconnect. And a lot of that had to do with sort of the political situation that was sort of fostered in this country after 9/11. But as a result, the Chicago Community Trust, which is, I think, the country's second or third largest community foundation, basically came to us and said, why don't we create a fund, a competitive grant-making fund that, all of the donors could sort of contribute their dollars that way, and then I could run it sort of as a volunteer, because I was performing. And start to learn about, start to connect the donors and the organizations in a way that everyone sort of felt was a little bit more institutionalized. And so we started in 2011 with about 5 donors that gave $25,000 annually, and I was sort of running it on nights and weekends. And fast forward 5 years later, and we have 25 donors, I think, who are now contributing an average of $36,000 each, all who just sort of really became enamored with this model of sort of coming together, creating a network, thinking about learning from our friends in the Jewish community, the Catholic community, of how do you sort of think about community philanthropy, and how do you build sort of institutions within our own community that can legitimately interface with philanthropic institutions and most importantly, raise the visibility of our leaders and our community organizations. And so, so in the 5 years that we sort of grew our organization, we kind of turned around. My co-founder and I kind of turned around about 12 months ago and said, you know, there's a big opportunity here. You know, like this sort of little fund that we created 6 years ago became one of maybe 3 organizations, less than 5 definitely, that were kind of, you know, really focused on American Muslim civic engagement. And I think that was the piece that kind of was really important to us, is that when we think about the community giving, we think about it sort of in, broadly speaking, in 3 buckets. There's sort of our religious institutions, the mosques and the Islamic schools. There's the giving back home, and then broadly speaking, we're talking about sort of civic engagement, the nonprofit sector. And because our community, because the 2/3 of the community that's immigrants have not been here for very long, our community organizations have been new or under-resourced and have a real difficulty in accessing funding and other types of resources. And so we kind of turned around and said, you know, I think we've got the makings of something really interesting here. And what I started doing was really kind of leveraging the power of philanthropy and philanthropic institutions. You know, given that I was someone that worked in the field for about 10 years, I started having conversations with people at the McCormick Foundation, and then some of my colleagues at the Kellogg Foundation and Ford Foundation and others, and started really, you know, thinking about ways to engage, how they could sort of engage with our community, but also with pillars, to think about ways to really encourage more and more community harnessing, this idea of harnessing our own wealth. I think there was a big opportunity here, because pillars has sort of become this institution that has really started to engage with these individuals and families in really meaningful ways. People who sometimes have been giving for a long time, but some people who just know that they want to engage with the community in some way and don't really know how to do it. And so real quickly, I think what you know, to me, what's really, really important about this conversation is to think about the ways that, you know, I am a really, really big believer in sort of taking control of your own narrative and telling your own stories. I think as Zeba and others have talked about, that is a critical piece to creating sort of the social change. And so, you know, one thing that I sort of noticed early on was, as Naren pointed out, that there was a lot of opportunity sort of for the reactionary stuff, which is actually very important because this is a community that I think is directly under attack. But we were also needing to think about what does things look like in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And we kind of sort of became obsessed around this idea of how do we sort of start helping our organizations, the ones that we're funding, really kind of think about the future and sort of start really thinking about institution building. So I want to just echo what everyone has said. I think I think the opportunity right now is so incredibly massive. You know, I hate to sort of think of, you know, I hate to think about the sort of circumstances in which, you know, why people are energized, because that's the depressing part. But the reality is that people are energized. People do want to do something, and I often joke that Pillars has sort of become in the business of sort of creating on-ramps. Like, I can't tell you how many people have sort of come and said, hey, you know, like, I literally had people calling me like days after the election saying, hey, how can we do something? What can we do? What can we do? And sometimes that's sort of working directly with us. Sometimes that's saying, you know, hey, there's this great organization that does work on the south side of Chicago. You should sort of get engaged with them, however it is. But regardless, I think there's a huge opportunity to think about ways to really show up in sort of the civic arena, not just sort of for our own rights, but for the rights of others, and sort of stand in solidarity with a lot of our brothers and sisters as we think about this work. So I'm very much looking forward to the conversation and happy to answer, especially Q&A. So with that, I'll pass it on to Ron.
Thank you. Good evening, and welcome. My name is Farhan Latif. I'm with the Al-Hibri Foundation. Thank you, Mark and Shark, for bringing us together, and to my fellow panelists, friends. And for those of you who have not signed the extra credit sheet, it's at the door. I'm just kidding. How this works. It's also an honor to be here on campus as a beneficiary of the work that's come out of here on philanthropy and fundraising. And so it's great to be here. So after 9/11, we saw an uptick in hate crimes, and myself as a student on campus, I remember when a professor pushed a student down the stairs in Michigan, and as a reaction to what was happening in the country. And that student then later came to me and asked for help and said, okay, can you please help advocate and figure out what can be done at this given time? So that became an important moment to start thinking about organizing and thinking about what one can do as a member of the community. And it was around that time I remember walking into my first Muslim fundraising event, where I walk into this hall, 1,000 people, and someone gets up and lays down a really important case about raising money for civil rights, raising money to combat this rising tide of Islamophobia. And the minute the case is completed to be made on stage, you see this imam-like figure come up on stage, the doors get locked, the food stops being served, and they start pitching, hardcore pitching, to give. And as this fundraising pitch is happening, the imam gets up and says, whoever gives today will get a house in heaven. And if you give 2,000, you'll get a better part of heaven. The property is much better. And I sat there and I looked around and I saw women taking off their rings and putting it in collection boxes, and people coming and taking out cash. And I thought to myself, it was an inspiring moment to see the level of commitment, people giving back. And I also thought to myself, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so that there became sort of starting my journey in philanthropy. And I was fortunate to go and work at University of Michigan through the Michigan Difference Campaign, working on the $3.5 billion campaign, and learning more about philanthropy and entering this sector. And so now I'm happy, 16 years later, to be working for a family foundation called the Al-Hibri Foundation. It was set up by Ibrahim Al-Hibri and his family before he passed away. And the foundation is looking at the question of a better understanding of Islam and Muslims in America, with some work still being done internationally, with orphans. We're based in DC. We have a staff of about 10 or so members, and a community space that's walking distance from DuPont, or walking distance from the White House. So it's a beautiful place to come visit. And so this foundation is really involved in looking at the question of philanthropy and strategic philanthropy. And the way I would describe it is that we're focused on the ABCs, which is advancing inclusion, inter and intra, building capacity of anchored institutions, Muslim anchored institutions, and then collective action. And that's the question of intersectionality, is how do you connect the dots of people that are working on these different issues. And what I've found is that, we find it often that it's easier sometimes to raise funds for 1.0 organizations, as we call it, which are the mosque, Islamic schools, some international giving, and so on and so forth. But it does become harder to fund civil rights, political, media, advocacy, or issue-based work. And so we're trying to focus our work on organizations, or these 2.0 organizations. And when you do some sort of landscape analysis, what you find is that the thousands of organizations that exist in this country, so many of them are stuck between the $100,000 to $300,000 operating budget. And yes, many of them are within their first 5 years, 10, 15 to 20 years. but there's a lot of work to be done. How do you get out of this stage of being stuck in that parameter? And so then what ends up happening is that when you hit prime time, like right now, where people are emerging to say, how can we be helpful? How do we help support you and your communities? Or, like Kash was talking about the calls, the two type of calls that I get. One, from allies in the country saying, we're ready, we want to support you. Which organization do we back? Which leaders do we support? Or which campaign can we come behind that the Muslim community is leading? Or two, from individuals who, didn't spend a lot of time focusing on their religious identity and cultural identity, but now are being forced or compelled to come out and say, I can't see my community being bullied, I really want to come and help. And what we find as an issue is that how do you take this overwhelming level of support and plug them into these organizations that are in formative stages, that are in early stages of development, and would love their time and energy and support, but don't quite have the infrastructure to take that on often, although these organizations are overstretched and under-resourced. So, so that's definitely one of the questions. When it comes to the question of building capacity, again, we find that the organizational leaders and boards are well-intended, are trying very hard to scale, but again, require a lot more investment of time and energy and capacity to learn how to move things along at a faster pace. So some of the pieces that I feel that are important, to conclude is that we want to still continue building this culture of Muslim philanthropy. We're spending a lot of time with individuals who are thinking about starting foundations. We want to see more prioritization of domestic work that needs to happen in institution building, invest more in human capital, and help these organizations even absorb the money. How do you write grants? How do you build and scale organizations, and so on and so forth. And with national organizations, the question of intersectionality, it's how do we see larger foundations today starting to see the bridge that Islamophobia is a leaf on the tree of racism, and then those are sort of the connections. And how do you make long-term commitments, not episodic commitments? So when you come out of a funding circle meeting, people are like, okay, well, I'm with this foundation, we should throw $500,000 on this issue for 2017, and then we're done. And the question is, no, it's going to take a long-term commitment to move these institution organizations forward and sort of build on them. So I'll stop there, but that's very interesting conversation.
So thank you very much. And this is the beginning of a conversation. And I think, as all the panelists said, I think we'd like to now open it up for questions from the audience, and we'll continue this conversation within this broader frame of community philanthropy, mainstream foundations, and this whole issue of, and I think as Farhan broadly put it, this idea that Islamophobia and a broader perspective on prejudice and racism.
And this is an interesting panel because not everyone's coming from the same work community within this space. I see nods, so I'm hopefully more or less on the right track. But we have several people who work in large mainstream foundations who may not be working directly on Muslim community philanthropy, but on other aspects of Muslim American life. We have one person from a traditional mainstream philanthropy who is working on aspects of Muslim community philanthropy. We have someone who now in his second appearance here, so we're going to make this a regular event, represents a Muslim community philanthropy, explicitly. And another person who represents a private family foundation that is heavily engaged with the Muslim community philanthropy sector. So it's a conversation in which people, I think, are coming at these themes from different work and personal perspectives. And Sharik set it up in this way by inviting this group, and I think it makes for a particularly interesting conversation. That's sort of my initial thought. Should we open it up and see what emerges?
And just one small, and you have Sunita, who's with a Jewish family foundation that is looking to make a grant to a Muslim community foundation. And I think that shows this broad, that the intersectionality is broader across, the values-based approach of looking at Muslim organizations and Islamophobia not as religious organizations, but as a component of American values. I think Sunita brings that really rich aspect of it. I guess.
I must say I was wondering, and so I'll sort of kick things up. I was wondering, as our speakers spoke briefly now, about the sort of two-edged sword of Islamophobia in the sense that it's something that the community philanthropy organizations and others have to deal with, have to react to. But I wonder whether at some level it's a negative for community philanthropy growth. And it interjects very real political and other complications into the actual process of growing community foundations and community philanthropy. It focuses attention, it needs to be reacted to, but at the same time, it's different from some of the other community foundations and community philanthropy groups that we interact with here at the Lilly School that aren't facing these kinds of issues and may just be facing questions of business models and business growth. But Kashif, you and others are not. You're facing a much more complex set of issues.
Yeah, I guess I would react to that by saying, and it's sort of echoing the point that Farhan made, which I think was a really good point, which was when I think about sort of engagement with institutional philanthropy, I think, having sort of been in foundations for a long time, I think the reaction is usually like Farhan said, like let's dedicate X amount of money in 2017 to this cause. And I think what happens there, as I'm sure you guys can deduce, is that once that funding, you get an organization, let's say they have a budget of $300,000, and then they get like $50,000 or $75,000, which is an enormous amount of money for them. They can do this great work and sort of combat, and once that money is gone, they're kind of back to sort of where they need to be. And in many respects, in some cases, they're actually worse off than they were because, that's they can't sort of continue the work that they were doing. And so part of, and there's lots of different approaches that sort of you think about, whether it's sort of the big approach that or different panels are taking, that I have sort of specifically thought about, with pillars is that, I've been sort of really sort of looking at ways to harness the wealth within our own community and creating networks of sort of people who want to create and who want to sort of harness their dollars together. And I think that for us has the most interesting thing, and I say this to my co-founder every year, is that we have now a pool of as of last year, it was about 25 people. And some of them we don't hear from, we engage with them, we don't hear from all year. And come September, I'm like, I know this person 3 times, and every single year, by December 31st, there's a $25,000 check trust, right? There's a level of sort of trust that I think has really developed. And it's interesting to sort of think about the motivations of why people want to sort of not just sort of give to sort of a specific organization, because I think what's interesting about Pillars is that I don't think that our donors are looking at it like we're giving to an organization. I think they look at it as like we're coming together to create something and create a network. And I just think that's a little bit different than the purview. So for us, we think about that specifically, Mark, and I think it's and I think we're all going to be in a situation where there is a lot of interest this year. And so how do you think about engagement in the long term? And as we have sort of supplemented our community dollars with foundation dollars with the sole purpose to sort of stimulate more growth. That's the sole purpose. Because I do approach this as if foundation dollars are sort of exciting right now, they'll be gone, and then won't affect us in a way because we're literally, telling people, this is great now, we're going to do this as well.
Questions? Please.
Yeah, I'll start with you. You're from the family endowment, right?
Why don't you identify yourself just so
Yes, I'm
the panel knows you personally,
Right.
but other people who will be asking questions, the panel doesn't know.
right.
So-
My name is Jenny Saliu. I'm a graphic designer. I work with Imana and Camp, and I'm coming from Chicagoland area.
What is IMA?
I'm sorry?
What is IMA?
Imana, Islamic Medical
Imana.
Association of North America.
Thank you.
Yes. So my question was briefly, when you mentioned that you're coming from a family endowment or family-backed or family-started fund, does that make a difference on how people get engaged or how they get attracted? Does that play a role? Does that element play a role in any kind of increase in people's interess
What do you
in
mean
the
by
foundation?
people? When you're saying people engaged, do you mean?
People who are interested in helping out or getting engaged with the organization.
So, well, our work gets people engaged because it focuses on what the project or what we're trying to accomplish. And if people can identify with what's trying to be accomplished, people will come in and lend support in that process. If I understand the question.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's how it tends to work. So for example, if we're focusing on a project that we do, which is on building narratives or helping support people share their stories and share their narratives on the work that they're doing, which is a program that we run, other people will step in and want to play a role in supporting that, either participating or by financially getting to it, or by recommending people to come and attend it. So that's kind of how it goes out.
Yes, I have a question. I'm Abdelzouk. I'm actually MA student here in school. And my question is, how do we educate our religious leaders in the community to help them understand the philanthropic arm in the community? And then, because we always, when we go to the mosque, they always ask you how to give money to expand maybe the parking, to do something within the mosque, usually, right? So actually, now the imams and the religious leaders, I like to just see them talking about things and issues beyond the mosque, beyond only Muslim issues, the whole community, we are part of the community. So how, as philanthropic leaders, how can you help our religious leaders to do that?
That's a great question.
I think there are two things that come to mind for me. One is that I heard this by some Islamic scholar on speech that he said that zakat, which is a important practice within Islam, its ultimate goal is to get people off zakat. Right? Which is this idea that your giving should ultimately create an infrastructure environment which allows the recipient to financially get to a position that they do not need to receive that money, and that they can actually be the one giving as well. That to me is like a very fundamental piece about building an institution, building an environment, infrastructure that allows for philanthropy not only to be engaged in solving day-to-day issues, but changing a holistic environment of a community. And so that's a religious tradition, and I feel like that's something to share back with the imams and scholars.
If I may share, and I guess I'm answering in my kind of lay capacity as like a community member. I think there are two spaces that are ripe for engaging with this. I think one is in terms of governance, and the boards of the masjids have to be key to understanding community needs. And by extension, I actually just think it's community demand for kind of more holistic services will push boards and imams to respond. Now, there's such high variance in like sophistication of governance structures or how built up and sophisticated like the institutions are themselves. But I can imagine that like if a community demands things, their leadership will respond. And I've seen that happen over the course of different communities in which I've been engaged. So really, if you distill it down, it's like how do you get communities more engaged such that they decide that they have a bigger vision for what they want, what role they want the mosque to have in their not just religious life, but civic and community building life. So I hope that answers, yeah.
I'd like to build on what both Farhan and Lorraine have said, and add this notion of having a Catholic sense and of culture, a broader sense. I don't mean in terms of the spiritual philosophy, but actually, yes, the values that come with a broader sense of culture is needed. I mean, this specificity is narrow, right? So the conversation's been really narrow. Now the next phase is to really open up and expand thinking and look at those intersections where the community can connect and should connect. So expanding the view is really important, and that comes with education as well, experience, as we know. I'm thinking of the whole, the group of Muslim chaplains in universities. Perhaps they can play a role because they're on campuses that have great diversity and have a view that could really help to work with the specific community-based imams. I mean, the rise of the imams in our communities and mosques came from a need when the Muslim community, the immigrant Muslim community, realized that their kids were becoming teenagers, and very quickly their attention was being diverted by jumping hormones and certain influences from their peers in schools. And so there was a shift, a cultural shift, where, broadly cultural Muslim community members suddenly, the women started wearing hijab, they started to look around for a mosque that they could send the kids to, or somebody who could educate the kids in religious studies, and volunteers came forward. So there was it was an ad hoc sort of moment in the life of the community, and there were all kinds of people that were brought on to teach the kids because it was largely a volunteer position, and busy professional parents didn't have the time or didn't have the knowledge. So they handed over responsibility to these volunteer imams. Eventually that expanded, they started to pay them something and so on. So it grew from there on the community level, and has had varying results. I know for a fact somebody who sent their children to a Sunday school in Westchester, a community leader, and one of the children was indoctrinated by this imam to go and fight in the war. And he went off overnight to Pakistan to a training camp and blew himself up. He was trying to make a bomb or something. And it was a wake-up call in the life of the American Muslim community. And a great deal of reflection, and that has been corrected. They established a family foundation and very concerned with this issue. So my point is that there are varying kinds of imams, and they need some professional development and some personal development also. So I think this is where the Muslim chaplains from universities can actually play a role because they have the knowledge base.
because you can get the same reward if you give for other causes, not only to build a mosque or expand the parking lot, right? So that's the understanding, the shifting of the understanding of the Muslim community need to know that the leaders need to play a role in conveying the message to our Muslims, right?
That's right.
So you give to homelessness or to refugees, you got the same reward as giving to your own. Thank you.
Can I follow up just for a minute by asking sort of directly, not for the private foundations in the room, but for Kashif and for the American Muslim Fund, we have a representative, whether the mosques view you as a competitor in fundraising? And Professor Alexander, who's next to me, could say probably something about this in Catholic or Jewish communities when these kinds of organizations got started in those communities too. But do you get pushback from mosques that see you as a competitor for fundraising? Or is the community so broad and the umbrella is so broad that everyone's sort of doing their own thing?
It's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't go, I haven't had any direct conversations with mosques to sort of, to sort of whether or not there might be some that sort of feel that way. But I can tell you that the reason it's not something that's sort of on top of my mind often is because the people that sort of we engage with have not really been involved in, most of them are not giving to their mosques in any sort of significant way. I think there is the appeal for something like Pillars is because they feel like the sort of community institutions that currently exist aren't sort of speaking to the needs that they sort of see, and that's not me making a direct comment on the mosques, but that's the reality of the situation. Is that it's not that I don't know any of our donors who've said we give 25,000 to the mosque and now we're going to give 25 to Pillars and not give anything to the mosque, so.
You want to say what?
Sure. My name is Muhi Khwaja. Very in the infancy stage of establishing a community foundation called the American Muslim Fund. But I think it's even beyond partnering with mosques. It's educating nonprofit organizations and the community as donors that it's a partnership. It's not that we're trying to steal money from causes. We're trying to empower organizations to provide them the institutionalized capacity to do the mission that they are set out to do. So I think it's a partnership in helping nonprofits and helping donors meet their philanthropic goals.
I'd love to hear from the panel about the recent gift to Notre Dame.
Oh, yeah.
The Ansari family. It was $15 million. Do you have thoughts about, would it have made the New York Times if it been given to a mosque? What was the significance of this?
Well,
For those who don't know about it, one of you might say a few words when you respond about what the gift was.
Sure. There was a family that recently, there was a New York Times article, a family that had made a $15 million donation to Notre Dame. And it was a sort of traditional American Muslim family that had been of the community, I believe, immigrants who had come here and sort of made this pretty massive contribution. I guess to me, it's a really good question around would it have made the news whether it was a mosque. I don't think it would have, truthfully, because I think what Pillars is sort of what we've been. Part of the impetus of what we've done is that story when it was sort of sent to me was not, and I don't think for many of us probably was not that surprising because we know that wealth sort of exists within the community. I think that there's what's happening is as sort of we've talked about sort of this generational shift, like when you think about the sort of immigrant community who primarily came here in the 60s and 70s and sort of now are thinking about philanthropy and sort of or legacy building for lack of a better term. it's not surprising because I think that's one of the sort of misconceptions of American Muslims, sort of in the countries, that we are sort of a very philanthropically engaged community, not just within sort of our own institutions, but you know, like if I were to sort of bring a handful of donors for pillars here, you'd see sort of how active they are in whether it's their universities, whether they're sort of their sort of everything down to their mosques, or whatever it may be, not mosques, but you know, other sort of. So I think what was really interesting about that though was like how much press it got. Like I think there's this like that was the piece of the story that I think, you know, like I don't think anyone was that surprised, like, oh, Muslim family giving a lot of money, but like the level of sort of press that story got was really fascinating because it sort of went into the backstory of who they were, and I think it kind of opened up a lot of eyes to sort of, and it's actually stories like that. When we talk about narrative shift, when we talk about narrative building, that's kind of like partly what we're talking about is like how do you sort of get those types of stories, because I guarantee that's not the only family that has made sort of multi-million-dollar contributions to universities, right? You know, there's also sort of a political moment right now that's going on that's sort of serving to sort of story. Anyways, I'm talking to myself.
Does everybody know what the purpose of this gift was? No?
Yeah, to fund an institute on the engagement, global engagement with religion.
Yeah.
I think the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, which opens up lots of interesting questions about who's doing the engagement and which religions are we talking about, especially since global can be a dog whistle for everything but you know, kind of U.S. American Christianity, things like that. So, but I was sensitive to the title of at least in the online, unorthodox.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's just being sensitized to various Islamophobic narratives, an unorthodox gift. You know, and given how the term orthodoxy is used in religious parlance, you know, and then to suggest that, you know, this isn't something that a Muslim would typically do. Maybe it's about Notre Dame, but maybe it's about this, you know, kind of open attitude towards, you know, religious engagement and all that kind of stuff. It's just that the article is kind of strange. It's great in some ways, but it's also troubling in some other ways.
I would, you know, my name is Thaib Yunus. I'm an entrepreneur, and last night, actually, Sharik called me a social entrepreneur after I described my company, so I guess that's what I am from here on out.
Sharik does have that effect.
He has the authority to say that.
And authority, moral authority.
I agree with what Kashif's saying in that I don't think that this is the first time a Muslim has made a donation like that. And in an earlier discussion, we were talking about capturing the Muslim narrative, the story of philanthropy. I think part of the challenge, or the reason why the story has been locked up in a box for the most part, and we haven't heard about it so often, is because one of the principles in Islam is to give from your right hand so your left hand doesn't know. So a lot of the giants are ghosts. So we're not going to know who they are and where they gave it. I think part of the reason why this Duke news was so loud, and this is just me guessing, my theory. One, I agree with Kashif again in that it's because of the climate. And number two, Duke's got a great press team. Notre Dame, I'm sorry. All of you guys have a great press team. I was thinking of Duke because we were talking about it last night. But you guys have great press teams, and you're trying to, you know, get other Muslims to donate who are alums of that school. You know, I went to Illinois, so you know, they're always calling and saying, hey, you need to donate. I told one of my professors that, you know, one day either me or my son, we're going to be the first Muslims to have our name outside a building. And I said, I'm going to do that. So I agree with guys, but yeah. Yeah, so that's the challenge in capturing the narrative and capturing that story. One of the things that we say now. I heard this from one speaker, and he was saying, he was teaching to an audience of Muslims, okay? And he was basically saying the same thing, that we've got to, the way we're going to change the opinion of the masses is by doing social service, by demonstrating, by telling our real narrative. And even though in Islam it says, give from your right hand so your left hand doesn't know, he said, I want you to be humble, but be loud. So that's what I tell people. I pass that along.
Zeba, did you want to say something about the Notre Dame gift this week?
No, I think we've covered it.
Okay. David, please.
A question, because maybe not all of you, but what I heard from many of you was not only are you helping shape the field of philanthropy in these different forms, whether community foundations, private family foundations, but then also you're also, much of your time is spent on the phone with nonprofits and other philanthropists and foundations and community partners. You're actually seeding these conversations and are bringing wisdom to the table and trying to network and create some of these environments that we've been talking about. And while that's always a part of philanthropy and foundation's role, I think that seems to be somewhat unique in the particular place where you are. That imagine that takes up a large percentage of your time that's unaccounted for by your board or even your donors. In some ways, maybe you might not have signed up for that vocational, professional part of your work. And I'd love for you to maybe just reflect on how that fits into your particular roles.
Yeah, so I remember attending Excellent Philanthropy Conference. There was this conversation of outsized impact. And I feel the work on sector building, on speaking to partners and convening at these communities which are expanding the role of the conversation, I feel is a way of having outsized impact as an organization, because our philanthropy from a community standpoint, from a relative community standpoint, is very large. But when you look at it from a philanthropic standpoint, it's actually very small. And so this is one way of expanding the conversation and allowing others to have a chance and opportunity to play a role. So I think it's definitely part of our work, and the board is happy about this work. So.
This one, yeah, please, Sunny.
So last year, the Ford Foundation held a one-day convening on Islamophobia, about a year ago, I think. And, you know, to be upfront, I'm culturally Muslim and not religious. So my relationship with the Muslim identification is very different from, I think, everyone else on this panel. But there was something about, in terms of talking about Islamophobia, there's something about the justice part of it, right? Like, I know that there's so many better things happening in our communities. That's what I grew up with. You know, my mom, I would say she was like a social worker. She's Hindu, but she went to heaven and is definitely, you know, is up there because she put together 17 marriages in our community, like those kinds of things. You see that happen all around you, and somehow those narratives are lost. I think within philanthropy, what I realized after that board convening is that they don't know where to put their money, and they don't know who to ask these questions to either, right? So, you know, sitting in the role that I do, I always saw philanthropy or being in philanthropy and bringing organizations to the table is that I'm an advocate. So if I'm not advocating for my own community, then I'm not really doing my job. I luckily landed in a foundation where I can do this a little bit more than I could at the Mellon Foundation. But I think that's a big part of it, is that philanthropists don't know, you know, we're talking institutional philanthropy, they don't know where to put the money. And there's not enough information out there to understand what are the better investments to make, right? So I think we all sit in a unique role that we can bridge that gap a little bit. And I think that's the start of part of this movement, is bridging that gap finally, and showing that there is a Muslim culture, but there is also the American culture that fuses with the Muslim culture, and people are forgetting that there's that, that side of it. I don't know if that addressed a little bit.
I'd just like to add to what Sunita said. Given where the Dar Street Foundation for Islamic Art sits and the Building Bridges program in particular, we feel very strongly we have a very important role to play. As I said earlier, we're the sole ongoing organization, program of its kind in the US, and we support projects, initiatives that use arts and media to make a difference between communities. Farhan used inter and intra-community work, and that's exactly how we view it, although we're a quote-unquote mainstream organization. And so really the Building Bridges role is to be an advocate of the arts approach for inter and intra-community work among Muslim and non-Muslims, and also within the Muslim community. Again, to follow what Sunita said, yes, the Ford Foundation had a very important meeting a year ago on Islamophobia, and we followed that in partnership with the Ford Foundation and some of our other colleagues a couple of weeks ago that focused on the use of the arts approach, the impact of the arts approach on issues of prejudice and Islamophobia. So it's important to keep the long view in mind and sustained advocacy for this space.
To sort of directly address real quickly what you and it goes back to the point that Farhan had made earlier, which was people. So because our sort of community institutions are often sort of in their infancy, or maybe not even in their infancy, but are in that $100,000 to $300,000 sort of budget range that Farhan had mentioned, it just requires a level of engagement that I think isn't, so like this role that I'm in is very, very different than when I was at the Muhammad Foundation. I was often working with 10, 15, $20 million nonprofits, national nonprofits that were working on lots of different issues. It's a different conversation. I don't think they're any better or worse, but it's just a different conversation to be having with them. And so I think and the reality too is partly why the work that everyone here is doing is so important, is because many of those organizations have often not. It really makes me happy to see a lot of our community organizations now gaining access to sort of foundation dollars, whether it's through the Fords of the world, and the Cummings of the world, with the Hickories, with the Pillars, with the Doris Dukes, whatever avenue it is through. That was something that 10, 15 years ago was so incredibly limited, if even happening at all. And so, but I think that's sort of the added. It's a good observation, because it's sort of an added layer of this work that, frankly, I had sort of anticipated, but not fully anticipated. It was so great that I actually had to hire someone to basically do just that, because it can almost be its own full-time job.
Please.
So this is kind of building on that type of question, but how do you engage more traditional blue-collar types of communities in terms of the rhetoric and the misconceptions of your guys' space in general, as philanthropists in particular? But there's more of a willing ear in the academics and some of the more elite nonprofit types of organizations. But how do you engage the people within the traditional blue-collar who are not necessarily as willing initially to hear what you have to say?
I would like to respond to that. Late last year, my program made a grant, for a pilot project to the University of Iowa's creative writing program, which is a very respected program. And they have the international writing program, then they have the creative writing program. And it was specifically to the international writing program for this reason, that they did a writer's residency, a full immersion residency with Turkish and Armenian writers. That was difficult, but very powerful. And by bringing those two groups together, you know the history. It put them into a very intimate, several-week situation where they were eating and sleeping and waking together and studying certain texts together and then producing their own writing based on that experience in some shape or form. And it had ultimately a very strong impact because it created relationships between the two groups. And many of those relationships have endured. They continued to stay in touch after this residency. So the head of the International Writing Program is this summer going to do this pilot writing residency for high schoolers from white blue-collar communities and American Muslim high schoolers. And they are going to bring them together in Iowa. As you know, the city itself is blue, but the state is red now. And they're going to use the same model, and they're going to work with a Canadian Muslim faculty member and others who do this work to, again, throw them together, have them live in the same dorms, and read very specific texts to really to expand their critical thinking, and then have them write, to express their feelings in writing. And then they'll measure the impact of that and give us the results. That, has a very particular intention, that initiative. And I'm very excited to see what happens. I think it's going to be, I'll be out there actually to be a fly on the wall for that residency. I think it's going to be challenging, but I think it has potential, some very interesting potential.
So coming from a Jewish family foundation now, I'm learning a little bit more about interfaith work, and a lot of the work that's being done is getting sort of the leaders of different religions that are maybe on opposite ends of the spectrum together to speak to their communities about sort of that bridge building, because a lot of it can come from the heads of religious organizations. The other path, which just feels instinctual, generally speaking, is children, right? Kids going through getting them at a younger age, and if anyone's going to change the hearts and mind of someone who has something ingrained in their head, it's going to be their kids and the younger generation. I've seen that happen with a lot of parents where their mentality changed about things because their children framed it to them in a certain way, and they were able to see it in a different way. So I think those are two paths that no one really talks about too much, but it's definitely there, and I know that at NCF we're looking to make a more concerted effort to make that happen.
Other comments on reaching out to blue-collar folks?
I think I would definitely echo the mention. Interfaith has been one access point to reaching different communities, and we've been doing work on that. And as a matter of fact, when you do interfaith work, one of the questions that comes up is what kind of interfaith work? There's almost 20 definitions of interfaith work. I'm sure you probably talked about that last night. So how do we reach and access communities that are not part of the conversation often is the topic at hand. On the second point, I would say that we're actually open to seeing, especially given the national dialogue and discourse, it has an impact to think about, where is philanthropy missing? Where is our work missing? And so we're actually open to finding projects and organizations and leaders who are interested in actually helping doing some bridge building work, and we'd be open to seeing those proposals when we open up our grant cycle. So if you or anybody here knows about some of those projects, we're actually interested in
context, that's like the $1 million question, right? Like, it actually kind of keeps me up at night. It's like, if are we just sort of preaching to the choir, like in 20 years from now, or, you know, are we just sort of having conversations with people that already sort of feel this way? And so, you know, I think that, you know, there's a couple of different approaches. You know, I think obviously I agree with everything that's been said. I also think there needs to be sort of a broader conversation around sort of how, when we're talking about American Muslims, like how American Muslims are sort of portrayed in like everyday life, like, and that's like through pop culture, through sort of media, through Hollywood. I think that, you know, a lot of these things have to work in tandem because you can sort of really reach a lot of people through popular culture in a way that I think that a lot of other mediums don't have. You know, like when we sort of look at the ways that the LGBTQ community is sort of claim their narrative, no one would say that, you know, pop culture was the reason why that happened, but it certainly was a key strategy in terms of helping shift the ways that that community was perceived, you know, in a short amount of time. You know, you're talking about the AIDS crisis in the early 80s to like going out to like Ellen coming out, which I think was in 97, which was received very well, to now Ellen being like the most popular celebrity in the country. I think there's real value in thinking about ways that we're sort of portrayed. And that's something that we think about a lot. Like, you know, one of the things that we've, you know, as I know everybody on this panel, we try to get together as often as we can to sort of think about, you know, what everyone else is doing and sort of where we can help or what directions that we can take that maybe other people don't have the capacity to take. I think we're all kind of really concerned about that particularly. I mean, I think this election was a result of a lot of people sort of speaking to their own audiences and not sort of, so it's a great question.
And I'll just add, in my work with other social movements, especially labor, there's been a real embracing of just intersectional solidarity, taking on Islamophobia. So I think if labor is a part of the conversation, organized labor and any other movement organizing in that space, I've just been really surprised by the deep level of commitment and opportunities in that space. And I really hope that that's not just a part of this immediate moment, but kind of a long-term. I hope people invest in those relationships and see where that goes.
And real quickly, Kashif mentioned the pop culture sort of route. There is actually a pop culture collaborative that we've just gotten our ED in place. NCF is part of it. It's starting, and it took about a year to really launch. But part of that will be talking about changing Muslim narratives in Hollywood. Like the working group is going to have a discussion about that. How do you get some of these experts into the room with the writers to give a real portrayal of what Muslim culture is, not what, you know, the standard terrorist narrative is, right? So that is actually actively happening. And I think that is a way, when you look at it, you know, television is the one thing that everyone sort of engages with. So even if they don't actively think it, it's somehow in their subconscious, hopefully drilling something into it, right?
This is going to sound like a pitch. Yeah, I'm Scott Alexander from Catholic Theological Union. I'm also on the Lake Institute Advisory Board. It's going to sound like a pitch. It's not really, but just to sort of understand how this could all work. Do your organizations grant money to institutions with a certain capacity to then do mini grants themselves in order to see this work? I mean, that's something that some of you do.
It's an important part of what we do because we don't have the, you know, we don't have the bandwidth.
Yeah, because you know, there was a recent study that we commissioned out of the Bridge Initiative at Georgetown, studying attitudes towards Islam among Roman Catholics. And one of the findings was that the Catholics who read Catholic literature from Catholic publications about Muslims and Islam are more likely to have negative attitudes towards Muslims than Catholics don't. And there are a lot of other revealing data about percentages, and that, it's disturbing. The church is in a place where officially, with church teaching, this should all be about dialogue and mutual understanding. There's a famous church document that says the church regards with esteem the Muslims. That's out of Second Vatican II. And there's really no equivocation on that on some very basic level. But so far, there's been no effort, to sort of look at the landscape of Catholic parishes across the United States. Like in a city like Chicago, but then across the United States, and offer grants for religious education folks, who have a vision for reaching some of the people that you're talking about, who populate lots of different Catholic parishes across this country. And it just seems like there might be, I'm thinking of the Muslim Journeys Initiative of the American Library Association that was done at libraries, but to sort of try to replicate that on a parish basis. But that's something that could work. Huh?
I mean, the Muslim Journeys was funded by the Building Bridge along.
Carnegie also was a lot of big image.
Yeah, and it came under fire.
Of course, yeah, I know it's part of it. So.
No, I think that religious literacy is really needed because the interpretation of the literature of spiritual philosophies determines the course of our lives. I mean, through the cycles of civilization, we've seen this play out again and again, and we come to the same points again and again. When there's literalism, we have one issue. When there's a broader, more humanistic interpretation, we have a different kind of culture and mindset. And those are the 2 points that we keep rubbing up against, those 2 perspectives. So it's very important, but there are funders that focus specifically on supporting these kinds of initiatives. And then there are those that actually will combine with, collaborate with say, other kinds of funders, with different focus areas to support issues like that, So it can be both. You probably know some of those funders, given your subject area. But more are stepping forward now to collaborate along the intersections. Intersectionality has become a really big buzzword. Suddenly, which is
been around for a while. It's been around.
Yeah, but it's really popping in the philanthropic community anyway. You hear it all the time, along with
because there's so many cross-cutting cleavages of identity that experience oppression, and then they layer on top of each other. So like, there's no riper moment. I mean, it's a buzzword, but for a reason. Like
Absolutely.
My goodness, how many different vulnerable communities can experience so much at once? So absolutely.
Comes out of Black American womanist.
Yeah, Kimberly Crenshaw. Yes, or that. Yes. Yeah.
One question I have for the panel is this, the role of foundations, right, and role of philanthropy, and traditionally there are many, but arguably one is, of course, to give money and sort of help organizations along. The other is to build capacity. It's not through money, but through the advice that you give and the connections that you make. But I think, at least in my view, one of the most important roles philanthropy has played is that of innovation or risk-taking. Right? And that seems to be somewhat in a modern foundation, the way the modern foundations are looking at this, there's this huge tension on whether that's true, and there are arguments on both sides. But one question I have for you guys is, it seems to me within the Muslim community space, there aren't enough risk takers, right? And that's the problem that's facing, and that's why the parking lot is so important in terms of the ISPUs, the UPFs, right? All the risks, the biggest risks taken were by individuals, and we know from research that individuals only have so much money and only so much capacity to take the risks. And so my question is, how important is that element, in terms of this risk element, in terms of the way you think about Muslim community in the space and philanthropy, because at least when I think about the American Muslim landscape, I see a lot of traditional stuff, right? A lot of advocacy stuff, a lot of mosques, a lot of relief organizations, a lot of schools. I see very few of the UPFs and the ISPUs, just to pick on two, right? And I think, and I'm wondering whether that's because there haven't been enough risk takers taking, sort of stepping up.
Well, at the risk of, if you don't mind me jumping, at the risk of just reiterating what you said, when you experience scarcity, it can go one of two ways. You can just you can try anything because you're just so desperate, or you can you want to feel safe. And I think we haven't talked about some of the really challenging moments post 9/11 when it came to philanthropy and the real persecution and scrutiny of a lot of giving within the community that caused trepidation, that caused, I would say that it was formative for so many people and how, and shaping, and I'm actually surprised we haven't talked about it yet, but like that shook everyone up. And so, yeah, like for good reason, people are not interested in taking risks. There's such high level of scrutiny when it comes to giving, who's involved, you can't control everything. And so I actually really do understand that, but I think that makes the obligation on institutional funders rather than individuals. I just feel like there's, we ought to have the appetite for risk. I think about this in all of the grant making we do institutionally, like you have to expect a certain level of failure and just oops, and rewarding the things that go really well and forgiving the moments. So I'm so glad you raised that. Now is the moment not to be scared and curl up, but to take risks. And one of the best ways to mitigate that is to work together with, in collaboration with folks who you may sometimes work with all the time, new people. I think it's a really exciting moment for that as well.
And I think within philanthropy, there's a cultural shift happening, right? Younger generation of people working in foundations are coming in and they have different ideas. These are traditionally white institutions that have been operating in a certain way and have not looked at inclusivity or diversity as much as they should have up until this point. So I think part of it is that culture needs to shift from the inside, and I think it's just going to take some time. And I'm talking from the arts perspective. I've been in the process of trying to find Muslim artists to get them together, and it's actually a really hard thing to do. You'd think a network exists, it doesn't. And a lot of people just don't want to associate themselves with Muslim because part of the reason is if they try to get funding for any of their projects, there's always the stigma associated with that word. And trying to embrace it and get funding, there's some sort of cultural misunderstanding happening where people don't understand the project, funders don't understand the projects as well, and they're not willing to take the risk because they don't understand it. They just think it's too vague of a project instead of, looking at it from a different lens. And you can't look at it from a different lens if we're not changing the culture from within, right? Go ahead.
I wanted to add to the point that Narayan mentioned, which was, I think, you're right, I'm surprised it hasn't actually come up and it's actually a critical piece of the Pillar story that I didn't actually bring up, which was part of the reason why Pillars sort of exists was because, when I talked about that disconnect wasn't because the donors and the organizations didn't know each other. The disconnect was because there was such a level of fear, like the 9/11, the Patriot Act sort of shook this community, that when you have people that we were working with who are sort of high level, whether executives or running their own funds or whatever it might be, they can't afford even the slightest bit of an organization that's sort of accused unfairly of any type of whether it's domestic terrorism, financial impropriety, whatever it might be. So the partnership with the Chicago Community Trust was actually critical in our early days because, and I have to give so much credit to Terry Mazzani, who is this incredible leader who came to us 6 years ago and said to us with a group of people and said, Terry Mazzani and the Chicago Community Trust have your back. And the level of comfort that gave for donors, and to be completely honest, it's funny that was there, but that sort of selling point, I guess, around the CCT relationship was sort of waning a little bit over the last couple of years, but in the Trump administration, every single one of our donors has come to us and said, we're still with CCT, right? We're still partners with CCT, right? And it's true, and it's because it's really, really important for us to sort of understand that piece within the context of risk taking, because it's really hard. But on the flip side of that, what I am seeing, listen, I think Pillars exists because of the generosity of our individual donors 5 years ago who sort of came together to create this. But in the last recent year, it's because of people like Ford, it's because of people like Kellogg who are taking a massive risk on us. This is my co-founder and I have been, we joke, like we just sort of been like in our suits, like hustling in New York, trying to like get people to like care about what we're doing. And there were like, weeks where we would just sort of be there talking to a bunch of people, and we're very, very, very fortunate that given how, despite us being sort of doing this for 5 years, but sort of the new vision of this, it very much is a risk. It's
so not though. It's like not like when I say risk, I mean like real palpable risk.
Yeah.
Like you run such an efficient, well done shop. Like that's not. I don't need to say it's not risky.
Yeah.
It's political capital
Sure.
and other sensitivities you're managing, but it's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, well, I
You
was
guys
more
are great.
that. Thank you. Not everybody agrees with that. So, but meaning that, what I mean by that is, and I well, thank you for the kind words, but really just the idea that there is sort of still an early stage idea that they haven't engaged with, like Nathan Cummings, I think is a perfect example of an organization. I have it's so exciting to see this then bringing out Sunita to say, like, this is what we want to do. And they're being so incredibly thoughtful about how they want to engage. That doesn't always happen, and I think that it kind of goes hand in hand. Our community, I'm sensitive to those sort of risk taking because we do need to take more risk. I completely agree, but I left a very stable job to do this, and so it's also very, very scary. So I get it from both ends.
I think Pillars got the funding from Kellogg and from Ford. There's always field shifts. When the big guys do something, then everyone else follows. That's just how philanthropy works, right? And I saw that being sitting at Mellon doing performing arts grants, how the Mellon name really leveraged other sources of funding for these organizations, which is important. So we're in a moment where that's finally happening a little bit more, the risk taking, but I also have this argument that like we can't, and in terms of artists especially, I'm like, we can't ask them to bend to our rules anymore. Like this is not a space where that framework works for this population. So we need to start bending to their needs a little bit more in terms of where we're putting our money, where we're investing, and trying to have the most impact that we can have with those dollars.
You really brought out the passion in that, Shar.
Let's maybe take one more question and then end a few minutes before 3 so that especially people at the school who would like to meet our panelists or some of the other guests here can do that. And please.
Pat Danahay Jen, I'm a third-year doctoral student in the Philanthropic Studies program. In my mind, I'm asking myself, is there something that you would identify that is very different about Islamophobia today as compared to after 9/11? Because what I'm hearing is that you are in the process of institutional building. It might feel weak, but it still exists. The networks that weren't there before are there now. Is there a national consciousness of overall, when I say national American consciousness, of contributions of Muslim Americans on a general basis? And how is Islamophobia different today that affects your reactive work, number one, and your long-term work?
I'll just kick off real quick. I think people have probably different thoughts. I think, I guess people are already getting political, but I assume that's okay here. I think one of the big differences in today's world is that some of the most sort of ardent anti-Muslim, anti-sort of Islam activists have a direct line to the White House and have a direct influence.
Some are in the White House. Sebastian Gorga's in the White House.
And I think that has sort of taken on a very sort of new reality for Muslim communities. You know, it is incredibly. It's very, very concerning to see some of these people, you know, tweet out pictures of them sort of, you know, in the White House, and because they're hate preachers, right? And so I think that's, you know, there's a lot of different ways to answer that question, but I'll just sort of say that piece of it is from sort of just a community member to see these people and the level of access they have in today's administration. It's very, very, very scary.
Can I say two things just to respond? One is, you know, when I first would be involved in groups after 9/11, you'd often hear people say, I think the Islams really want to take over this country. So basically, someone who's reading some stuff on the internet but doesn't even understand the difference between the term Islam and Muslim. Mm-hmm. Now you'll hear people say, Ibu Patel is pursuing his da'wah-based mission to have Sharia law established. It's a very kind of Islamophobically literate now. No, because since 9/11, there has been what Nathan Lean has famously called in the book of the same title, the Islamophobia industry. Which then leads me to my second point, which is philanthropy funds Islamophobia. And that's an interesting datum for all of us. And I'm wondering if at some point this space couldn't even be a space for convening foundations who are on different sides of issues that have to do with divisiveness in our society, and whether or not there's any space for conversations between foundations that have an interest in combating things like Islamophobia, and not that other foundations would see themselves as supporting Islamophobia, they'd frame it in another way. But it seems like that might be a conversation that would be perhaps difficult to convene, but if we were able to manage it, perhaps one that would have a felicitous impact.
I'd buy tickets.
The first point, can I add something real quickly to that first point, which is, I always tell this story because it was such a sort of pivotal moment in the way that I thought about this. Like, I think this was 5 or 6 years ago, I was at the McCormick Foundation, and we funded, journalism was one of our big areas that we funded, and we held, the journalism team, which I was not a part of, held a gathering of journalists to talk about ways to sort of be more culturally sensitive to Muslims and the way that they were reporting on Muslims. And so this community was in Nashville, and they told me to go because I was like the one Muslim on staff. Nobody should go to this. I'll go. And I went, but they had this town hall meeting. This was right around the time of the Murfreesboro mosque controversy, where people didn't want this mosque being built. Long story short, there was this mosque they were trying to build, and the community that came out and was like, we don't want this here. It's a terrorist training camp, blah, blah, blah. And what was fascinating, though, they held this town hall meeting that was open to the public, and it was hosted by the ACLU and a few other, and Vanderbilt and a couple of others. And this gentleman came, and he, you know, and after, during the Q&A, he was someone that I didn't want to stereotype, but certainly didn't seem friendly to Muslims, and he wasn't. And he stood up and he asked a question, and he asked one of the panelists, he said, how do you justify the concept of taqiyya in Islam? Now I grew up with a mom that was a God-fearing mom who was pretty religious. I had never heard of this word in my entire life, right? I was like, what the hell is that? And I remember calling my mom that night, thinking, what is taqiyya? Like, is that something that I should know? And she just started laughing, and I'm not the sort of religious scholar, but the basic understanding from what I understood is that this idea of being able to sort of preserve your life if someone is, you know, has a gun to your head. I'm using a stupid example, and you know, eat bacon or something. You can do it, right? Just preserve your life. But the way that they've sort of reframed the conversation is that we are taught and encouraged to lie. And it's so insidious because there's no way, because if you say, like, that's not true, they're like, that's what your fake's telling you. It's actually incredibly insidious the way that sort of concept has been perverted. But to your point, what was the most fascinating thing is that I had never even heard of this word. This was not sort of, and I was like, these guys are more religiously literate than I am, and so it was a huge sort of turning point for me around the way that I understood it. So.
Mira, do you want to introduce what?
Sorry, I'm
really. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I would like to just answer your question as well, and everything everybody said, but in my mind, the difference between post 9/11 Islamophobia and now is that was reactive. A trauma took place, and everybody tried to do their best to address it. Now it is with political purpose. It's systemic, and so it's deliberately creating that divide or going deeper with it for political purpose.
Which we see across the board.
Yes.
On lots of issues.
Sure.
Yeah.
So that's, in my mind, the difference. Reactive and this with a political purpose. Very selfish political
Do you mind if I add a little more? I'll just add one more thing, which is it's like we thought we got past something. So again, I think most of my remarks today have to do with me as a community member and not, not professionally. But I'll just say, I think there's a sense of exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, and just feeling beleaguered and feeling like it's 5 steps back and even further back repeatedly. And so you're almost just when's this going to end? So there's that aspect of it too on the community side, a collective feeling of helplessness and just moving backwards. Also, there was such amazing progress made over the last decade. I mean, there's a whole army of amazing American Muslim lawyers who went to law school inspired by thinking about themselves in a really newly civically engaged way. It's empirically demonstrable. But there's also things that happen, then you go to law school and you realize how hard it is to be a public interest lawyer, and then you end up in a corporate job, and then now we have all these so there's a whole, so there's just been so much stuff happening in the community in the last decade, and so I think people are tired.
I think from the systemic, just really quickly, perspective too, is that America's been in a pressure cooker for the past, since 9/11. And so if you look at the economics of how much hate has grown in the past 10 years for the Muslim community. And all of a sudden, in the past few years, you just see everything exploding and everyone having extreme reactions, and it's spread like wildfire, I would say. It's a lot of just sheer ignorance. There's a lot of separation as well between the communities. When they're not engaging with each other, they make judgments about each other instead of seeing what their commonalities are. But I think because we got to a moment where everything was falling apart, the racial tension, the fact that racial tension is being talked about the way that it is being talked about at this point, and talking about racial bias, etc., that all of those things weren't there before. They were in the conversation. They were happening on the grassroots level, but not on this national public platform. And it's because of the political situation as well, but just sort of generally, the state of our American society is not great.
The only thing I'd add to this is I think what I see as a big difference is I think Islamophilia is just as much of a problem as Islamophobia, right? So even those that currently, it happens to be on the left, that want to champion Muslim rights or Muslim, they want, but we to be an American Muslim that fits that, they have created a box as well. And so in the past, on the left, people that were opposing Islamophobia came to it through empathy, which was interesting and had its own challenges. But now the people that are fighting against Islamophobia outside of the Muslim community also come to it through a political purpose. And that political purpose doesn't help the Muslim community. Because both, in order for us to satisfy the right or the left, we have to be someone that they want us to be, rather than who we are. And I think that is something that I have never witnessed until this last year. And so it's an interest. So I think that's a big change and a big challenge for us as a community, both individually as well as professionally, as well as within our philanthropic activities.
I'm scared by that.
It's a very smart observation.
It would be folly for me to try to summarize this extraordinary discussion over the past 2 hours, so I'm not going to try to. I'm going to merely thank our 5 panelists and all the terrific questions and other guests we've had here today for a terrific discussion, and turn it back to Sharik, and again, thank all of you, especially our panelists and others who've come from long distances to participate in our workshop series today. And I'll turn it back over to Sharik.
I just wanted to echo your thanks to this amazing panel. I think when you dream of something in your mind of what you want to do as an academic, sometimes it doesn't work out. And this worked out really well. I wanted to thank Mark. Mark's been visiting Mott Chair for the past 2 years. And in many ways, Mark came to me a couple of years ago and said, I'm thinking about doing this, and I want to help your cause in talking about Muslim community philanthropy. And it takes leadership and vision to do that. And I really appreciate Mark's leadership in this role to make these 2 convenings happen. I want to also thank my friend David King, who at Lake Institute of Faith and Giving has really created a space within the school for the work that we're doing. The only other thing, and I'm similarly not going to summarize because I think your words in their original form are the most eloquent. I do want to recognize a few people in the room, just not from the purposes of recognition, but so that you all know some of the people that have flown in just to be part of this conversation. And so Muhi Khwaja is here from California, is trying to create an American Muslim Community Foundation. Mira Nigaz is here is the executive director of the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding. They do the American Muslim poll. They've done some research on civic engagement and philanthropy, and really important research for those of you that are studying. Go check out their website. But thank you. Mira is here from DC. Tayyib Yunus, sorry, is out of Dallas. Is a social entrepreneur. I do have I'm English, and I bring with it the authority to give titles. And then we have Rashid Ahmed, who's the executive director of the Islamic Medical Association of North America. It's one of the oldest Muslim immigrant professional organizations in this country, and he's here from Chicago. And of course, we have Cengiz, who does all the web and so on, and he will be taking testimonials and photographs for those of you that are willing to give a couple of minutes. He'll be outside.
Just outside the hall. Couple of minutes won't take long.
So he has a couple of questions he'll ask you, and we'd appreciate it if you could give him his testimonials. But thank you very much for those who are on the panel, as well as those that are in the audience.
Please, for the students and others who are here, please come up and meet our panelists or any of the other guests.
We're excited.